I think I know almost everyone here, but for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Eve Stern, Director of the Center for the Humanities, and welcome to the third talk in our 20. Oh, I'll talk louder.
The microphone is.
It's not on.
It's on, but maybe I'm just not talking.
Okay.
Short person problem.
Yeah. So this is the third talk in our 2021 to 22 Brown Bag Lunchtime series. I'm delighted to have Kathy DeCesare here today talking about Bermuda Prize. First, I would like to introduce my colleague, Rod Mather, Professor of History and Archaeology at URI.
I think I'm supposed to stand here, so I will. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine DeCesare, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Rhode Island. Dr. DeCesare specializes in Rhode Island history and colonial America, women's history, and legal history and applied history. She received her PhD from Providence College in 2000. The research project that she's going to talk about today is part of a long voyage. It started in the mid-1990s when Dr. DeCesare was part of a team based out of Brown University that won an NEH grant to organize the Brown family business records, mostly held at the JCB. As part of that work, Dr. DeCesare authored an extensive finding aid for the records and became an expert on the full spectrum of the Brown family businesses. Today, Dr. DeCesare will talk about the voyage of one of the Brown and Ives ships called the John Jay that sailed to the Far East between 1804 and 1806. In addition to being a fascinating sea story, Dr. DeCesare shows how the ship navigated the contested seas during the Napoleonic Wars and how the legal maritime structures of the early republic represented continuity as well as change from pre-revolutionary America. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. DeCesare.
Thank you, Rod, for setting the stage. It fits perfectly with what I'm going to talk about today. Can you all hear me? Okay, all right, good. So a special thanks to Eve and the Center for the Humanities, and I also want to thank my colleagues in history who showed up in great force, so that's awesome to see you all here, and the College of Arts and Sciences as well. Thank everybody for joining us today. A special thank you and a shout out to all the folks I met in Bermuda over the course of this research trip. Everyone was so helpful, so welcoming, so gracious. It made the process so much easier to do while I was there in terms of the research process. So we will, without further ado, sorry it's a little blurry. I took this from the plane. This is my own shot from the plane. So the working title of this project is Bermuda Prize, and of course, prize meaning referring to prize of war. The Providence-based Rhode Island ship John Jay was captured by the British Navy in early January 1806. It was brought to stand trial at the Vice Admiralty Court in Bermuda. She was detained in St. George's for some 6 months before waiting for the trial and then waiting for the decision. The vessel was and the cargo was ultimately condemned, and the decision resulted in a quick appeal process to the High Court of Admiralty in London, where the decision was ultimately reversed. So this was particularly useful to me to actually go to Bermuda, to actually see where the Jay was anchored. It was also very helpful to me to become familiar with the landscape of St. George's in itself and Bermuda in terms of how everything related to one another. Because the visuals are important so that I can reconstruct the narrative, which is one of my goals here, to provide some framework for the scholarship, for the legal story, the legal scholarship that's going to result. So this is where I spent my time in August. This is the archives, the coldest room in the probably all of Bermuda. Literally, I put on all my clothing and went into that realm. It was probably 50-something degrees. But I spent about a week there. I also visited the National Museum and the Historical Society and the library, and made a lot of friends along the way. So my goal was initially to fill in the gaps and to find more legal connections between Rhode Island, Bermuda, and Great Britain. So the ship John Jay arrived home from her, a little bit of background, the ship John Jay arrived home from her 5th voyage in the middle of September in 1804. She sailed into Narragansett Bay, stopping briefly at Beaver Tail on your screen, off the southern tip of Jamestown, where she took on board a pilot that helped her guide her up Narragansett Bay. After a very quick turnaround in terms of restocking the ship's stores, the Jay departed Rhode Island waters by September 21st, 1804. So this is actually the titular start of the sixth voyage. So this 2-year voyage from 1804 to June of 1806 provides like a case study. And it intersects the economic, the political, and the legal dimensions of the Atlantic world and the global economy as it existed in the early 19th century. So American maritime businesses were trying to keep afloat literally during the Napoleonic Wars. The rules were complex, the rules were changing midstream, and an important part of the research shows that all of the people connected to this vessel were very much dependent on its success for their survival. They needed this vessel to come back to port with the profit. So there's a lot at stake here for the crew, the owners, the officers, and the community at large in terms of Providence as well. And even the larger community of Rhode Island, and as it intersects with the United States as well in the early national period. Let's see, just a little bit of, I don't know if you can hear, I have the video, you can hear it, you can transcend to Beaver Tail. The John Jay was built by the Providence mercantile firm of Brown, Benson, and Ives in 1794. She's built by really a renowned Rhode Island naval architect by the name of Colonel Benjamin Tallman. Ships are always, for those of you who don't know, ships are always referred to in the feminine. So just as a brief description, she had 2 decks, 3 masts. She was 109 feet, 5 inches long. Her breadth was 31 feet, 2 inches. Her depth was 15 feet, 7 inches. She was considered to be a 463-ton vessel, which meant how much storage she could hold in her hold, put in her hold. Brown and Ives, pictured on the screen here, became the sole proprietors of the business in 1796 at the age of 27. They owned the John Jay and employed all of the crew, the owner, the officers, and the supercargo. And the John Jay, it's important to recognize that John Jay was just one of many vessels that were operating in this world at the same time. And they're managing this from 50 South Main Street, the counting house in Providence. So maritime trade was only one aspect of their complex business ventures. These are their homes on the east side of Providence. The brick building on this side here was built by Thomas P. Ives. It's now the Goddard family home. The yellow building is 357 Benefit Street. It was the Brown Nightingale House. And that's now currently offices for Brown University. Actually, even I met there. We had shared an office at 357 Benefit Street a long time ago. The ship was named for John Jay, the Chief Justice of the new United States Supreme Court. He was the statesman most responsible for the Jay Treaty. This was a treaty between the United States and Great Britain that attempted to solve unresolved issues pending since the American Revolution. So the vessel was launched a month before the signing of this treaty. And this was not really a coincidence. Brown and Ives were staunch Federalists, and the naming of this ship was a very clear and strong political statement on the behalf of the owners. An important part of this project concerns the people that intersected with the Jay over the course of this voyage. So her crew, the officers, the supercargo, the attorneys, the bankers, the insurance agents, the Bermudians, and the British naval officers. All of these documents, and this is an example of one that listed some of the names of the crew. This is the top with the captain at the top, and this is only a partial image because it can fit it all on the one sheet. But this is just gives you an idea of the numbers of people. I have a better representation here. This is a transcribed version of that previous list that ranks everybody in accordance with their seniority on board the vessel, starting with the master or captain on the top and the boy below. These records are certainly very valuable for us as historians. They provide a bunch of demographic information in terms of names, ages, heights, what they looked like, where they came from in terms of residency, place of birth, and citizenship. Now, the issue of citizenship is interesting, especially in this time period, because one of the challenges facing neutral vessels like the John Jay during the Napoleonic Wars was the issue of citizenship. How do you protect your crew? How do you protect your crew, especially from the British Navy? How do you prove you're a US citizen in 1806? How do you prove your identity? So think about this from the perspective of a world without photography, a world with no licenses, a world with no passports. Put this into context. How do you do this? How do you protect these people from being seized? So the image on your screen now is one way that the US government attempted to protect US vessels and US citizens. And this is called the Sea Letter. It was signed by the president, in this case, Jefferson, and it's going to be carried on board the ships. Citizenship and certainly the issue of neutral rights were particularly contentious all throughout this time period. And it was a reoccurring issue for the entire voyage, and especially in Bermuda, because the crew was particularly vulnerable. One example of this was a young seaman by the name of Arthur Love. He was from Providence. He actually has a series of works in the maritime industry, always gets into trouble. He frequently gets into trouble. A lot of it involves drinking, but he actually never makes it home. So he's one of the crew members that is pressed and never makes it back to Providence, and, with the rest of the folks. Another example is from the John Jay is the supercargo. His name was John Bowers, and he's second in terms of the signature on your screen. The captain or master is listed above. Bowers was responsible for negotiating the details of trade in terms of the trade negotiations. He represented the owners in all of their business transactions. He played a pivotal role on the entire voyage and in Bermuda. And I started researching him a long time ago because he just captured my interest of being a very engaging person. And actually, I don't have time to go into the details now, but it's a very tragic story of what happens to him in the end years later. More to come later. So we don't know what the John Jay looked like, or I don't have any evidence of what the John Jay directly looked like. This model is the ship Anne and Hope. The original painting of the Anne and Hope is in the reading room at the John Carter Brown Library, which is here. This is an image of that. This is the image of the ship Anne and Hope. The Anne and Hope was a little bit bigger than the John Jay, but this gives us a visual, something that we can work with in terms of a visual. So in the fall of 1803, the John Jay was painted. We know the John Jay was painted, what colors it was painted. I found the receipts. I was very excited about that. It was painted white, yellow, and red before it started its 5th voyage. We also know when it returned from Bermuda in 1806, in June of 1806, she was freshly painted once again, black, yellow, and white this time, before she set sail on actually her final voyage. She flew the American flag, but she's also going to fly the flag for the House of Brown and Ives, the mercantile house. She was considered a square stern ship, and she had no figurehead on the front. The bottom of the ship was actually coppered to protect it, provide extra protection from sea worms, etc. And this was done between voyages number 2 and voyages number 3 in the spring of 1800. Also, 1800 is pivotal because at that point in time, the ship takes on arms, so it arms itself in terms of providing weapons. So guns, meaning cannons, and other small armaments were placed on board. And so these firearms, or this assortment of firearms on board, were indicative of the realities of the time in terms of conducting business. Pirates were always a threat, especially in the Far East, in and around Batavia, and that's where they were headed. But these merchant vessels, even though they might have carried some armaments with them, they were no match for any naval vessel, whether it be British or French. There was no match there. So every time the John Jay encountered a British naval vessel, and they would encounter one 4 times over the course of this one voyage alone, Captain Fry really had no choice but to luff his sails and to stop. There was really no choice there. So before the American Revolution, this is Canton, China, and then British trade routes based on logbooks. Before the American Revolution, the Far East trade was a monopoly of the British East India Company. And colonial merchants were not allowed to trade directly with the Far East. After the American Revolution, the political dynamics changed and the trade was open to US shipping, and Rhode Island merchants are going to step up to this challenge right away. In Rhode Island, the growth of the China trade also resulted in the expansion of the local shipbuilding industry. To be successful in this global business venture, merchants needed bigger, larger vessels that had more sail power. It's only about sail power. So the ship John Jay was an example of this new type of vessel that was built specifically for the China trade. So in late September 1804, the John Jay is making its way across the Atlantic, sailing to Europe. Destination is Amsterdam, with a cargo of valuable commodities, mostly coffee and sugar, in her hold. En route across the North Atlantic to the North Sea, the Jay sails into a major storm, which seriously damages her. She made her way, kind of limped, actually, to the port of Great Yarmouth in England, and there the ship was repaired and then set sail for Amsterdam in the Netherlands. She arrived in Amsterdam late in the season and was iced in for the duration of the winter. This was not good for business, and there was a lot of correspondence back and forth about this problem of it's costing money to just sit there and do nothing. By the time of the spring thaw, though, they had offloaded the cargo and onboarded barrels of silver. 70,000 milled Spanish dollars were loaded into the hold of the John Jay. Today, approximately worth about $1.5 million. So this is big business. This is an example of this is a big business venture, and there was a lot at stake here. So once loaded and she cleared the port, she set sail for the Far East. From Amsterdam, the ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope and headed to the East Indies. It took some 130 days to actually make the journey and arrive in Batavia. Once in Batavia, trading was not easy. Commodities were in short supply, and it took time for the supercargo Bowers to actually get a sufficient cargo of sugar, coffee, tea, and some pepper. He had to do a lot of finagling and not a lot of negotiating. It was really a tough call there. So in addition to the weather, the trading and logistical challenges, political challenges also were ramping up in terms of mounting. The British Navy were increasingly concerned about Napoleon's string of continental victories and crowning himself emperor. So they stepped up their efforts to control the seas and the trade routes especially. And this is especially after the Battle of Trafalgar in late October 1805. So from the British Navy perspective, it was all-out war to defeat Napoleon, and to do so, it was necessary to stop and search all neutral vessels. So the Jay was stopped periodically. It was stopped by the British Navy on the way to Batavia. It was stopped leaving Batavia. It was stopped in the South Atlantic a few days after leaving Ascension Island. This was in late December, actually the day after Christmas, December 26, 1805. With each successive stop, the exchanges between the Americans on board the Jay and the British are going to increase in intensity. The fourth time the Jay was stopped was at the end of her final leg on her voyage back home. This time she was not so fortunate. She's actually captured by the British sloop, the HMS Driver. This is an artist's rendition here on your screen of this sloop. The details about this capture and the resulting trials that come from it from the perspective of the Americans that were involved, were quite revealing. And you get a real sense of the anger, the frustration, the fear. You get a real sense of the human collateral consequences, all as a result of this capture and the subsequent trials. So the details provide great insight into just the political, the economic, and the legal challenges faced by these Americans claiming to be neutral carriers. At the same time, they showcase significant continuity in the legal processes and protocols between Great Britain, Bermuda, and Rhode Island in how they relate to one another legally. They use the same language, not only just English, but that legal language of English law is persistent in all. And it helps with the facilitation of the case. So I'm going to provide you, let's see if this works. I'm kind of sometimes tech challenged. Oh yeah, so you can pretend you're at the beach. This is in Bermuda, to provide you with some sound effects and some context. And actually, just as an aside, there was no people there because of the tourists. There was no tourists during COVID. So it was like virtually going to empty beaches in Bermuda. It was really an interesting experience. So this should run out in a second, but January 6th, okay, 1806 at 9 o'clock. January 6th, 1806 at 9 o'clock in the evening, Captain Frey spotted a sail standing to the southward and another sail to the northeast, the northwest, sorry, with from the latitude of 2856 north and longitude 6843 west. Basically, they're in east of Florida, centrally located where Florida is today. The ship they saw on the horizon was in pursuit, and they're going to watch her approach. Okay. At this point, they really don't know who's chasing them. The next day in the morning, the ship following them was closing in. At 4 p.m., she was close and fired a lee gun across the bow of the J, and the J was forced to stop. The driver, the name of the British vessel, sent her boat over to the J, and the lieutenant ordered Captain Fry to take every piece of paper he had in his possession, including the logbook, and go on board the driver to meet with the commander, Robert Simpson. So the driver, excuse me, the driver was heavily armed. She was sailing in from Barbados when she made this capture. While Captain Fry was on board the driver, they sent for Mr. Bowers, the supercargo, to go on board the driver as well and bring with him his writing desk and all his papers that he had in his possession. They even searched the first mate's things, looking again for papers and documentation. Next, the British took most of the J's crew, the Americans, off the ship and put them on the British ship, and then they exchanged them for British crew members who were placed on the J, along with an officer and 2 midshipmen, and about 16 British sailors and Marines were placed on the J. So by 7 p.m., the J was under full control of the driver and the British Navy. They had their orders. They were to follow the driver. Captain Fry and Mr. Bowers actually returned from the driver and went back on board the J. Captain Simpson kept all of the ship's papers at this point in time, and he also kept the logbook, all the letters belonging to Bowers. And he's going to inform, Captain Simpson's going to inform Captain Fry that he was thinking about taking the ship to either Bermuda or Halifax. They're going to decide midway to go to Bermuda, possibly because of the weather. So the next day, on January 8th at 7 o'clock in the evening, the driver showed signal and they started making way. They were off. This is actually what the logbook looks like, and this is what we should have for the voyage number 6, but we can't find it, or I can't find it. It doesn't exist anymore. It was taken by the British commander. I was hoping it was going to be in Bermuda, but I didn't find it there. It wasn't in London. I'm still hoping it might show up at someplace sometime, but it would provide some additional information. So this is what the 5th voyage log looks like. So the sloop of war, the HMS Driver, was actually, this is a model of it, was one of the workhorses of the Royal Navy. It was Bermudian built, so it was actually built in Bermuda of local cedar, and it was built and launched from Nathaniel Tynes' yard, his dockyard, which was on the North Shore. And this was in 1797. He was one of the major boat builders of these sloops in Bermuda. So it's much faster. This boat is much faster than certainly the John Jay. And the driver's going to lead the way. So think of them in tandem. So the driver and the Jay in tandem are making their way to ultimately Bermuda. It's going to take several days. So this is going to be a tense situation for several days. This is not a quick, one-day journey. This is going to take several days to actually reach Bermuda. And the weather takes a turn for the worse. The weather gets increasingly bad, and the Jay is taking on significant water. It's not being pumped out appropriately. By the evening of January 9th at 8 o'clock in the evening, conditions were really bad. By 8:30, they were increasingly worse. The sails start to rip in terms of the jib, which is the triangular ones in the front. They start to rip. The first mate, Uriel Ray, makes the note in his documents that at 2 a.m., nobody slept that night. 2 a.m., they're up all night, securing and working to secure the vessel during the storm. Many of the other sails are damaged in the process. By Saturday, January 11th, the driver and the Jay approached Bermuda. 7 a.m., they see land. The driver's ahead of them, but they start to see land. The weather is improved by midday, and they see the island of Bermuda in the distance. At this point in time, as they're approaching the island of Bermuda, they had about 10 feet of water in the hole down below. It was getting increasingly problematic. This map is a 1663 Norwood map. There's another map later on, the Lampier map, that I'm going to show you. These are in the JCB library on the Brown University campus, and these are awesome. These are such artistic maps. They're big. They're like this big, very beautifully decorated, spectacular. So I tried to take the picture as best I could. It's interesting that the JCB has a much better map collection about Bermuda than Bermuda does itself. Okay, in terms of that. So JCB is far better than Bermuda. They didn't have anything. I was showing the archivist at Bermuda. She's like, well, we don't have that. We don't have that. So anyways. Moving along in our story. January 12th, Saturday, as they approached St. George's, they fired 2 guns, a signal for a pilot to come and navigate, to help them navigate into the harbor. Around the sandbars and the reefs. At 6 p.m., the driver sent 6 more men on board the Jay. They're still waiting for the pilot to come. They have to fire another couple of rounds of shots for the pilot to actually come on board the following day, which was January 13th. So by 10 a.m. on the 13th, they take a pilot on board, and they're going to actually sail into St. George's Harbor. I'm crossing the sandbar of the ship. Now, of course, by this point in time, it's really heavy with all the water it's accumulating in the hold, plus all the cargo that it's carrying in terms of the heavy cargo. So it's going to strike bottom a lot of times. And the captain, Captain Fry, is absolutely beyond angry at this point in time in terms of his writing, his correspondence. You can see his anger materialize on paper. At 12 at noon, they're going to be anchored in the harbor, which is, you can see that it's the smaller one up at top. I'll have a better shot in a few minutes. This is the harbor. So I took this picture from the hill. So once in the harbor, the ship goes to anchor, and the British cut away all the rigging, and they split the blocks, and they cut the ropes on board. The Jay's exact location in terms of her anchorage was a half mile out in front of the church on the hill, which was St. Peter's, which was on the hill overlooking the harbor. So the ship's going to be deliberately disabled while it's in the harbor, and it can't go anywhere. And it's going to spend the next 6 months just sitting there in anchorage, basically deteriorating as it sat there. St. Peter's was up on the hill, and actually that's a close walk, a close proximity down to the waterfront to Ordnance Island, and beyond that, I kind of envision the J being right out there. The driver's commander and the crew left the J in port after they disabled her, and they quickly headed back out to sea. They're going to be sweeping back and forth between Bermuda, Halifax, and basically hovering also off the port of New York City. At the end of 1805, the British naval patrols and privateers are going to accelerate in terms of the number of seizures of these neutral vessels. And the ship John Jay was just one of many ships seized during this time period. So the British naval officers, the crews, the vice admiralty, judges and officials certainly financially benefited from seizing these rich American prizes. The American ships and they're laden with products, are slow, they're heavy, and they're easily, particularly an easy subject to capture. They're easy to get. This is the original blueprint for the ship driver. It was used to construct the original ship, and then the artists that did the models, those models that I showed you, actually used the blueprint to construct the models as well. This is the town hall. This is downtown in St. George's. So once in port, Fry is going to come into town, and he's going to be escorted to shore by British naval officer, Mr. Purvis, and he's going to quickly file his protest with the secretary's office. Fry's going to make the assertion, and he's going to use the term that the John Jay was, and I quote, libeled by the captors. He's actually super angry at this time as well, and it was really well known that he had a temper, and because his employers talked about it, Bowers talked about it, they talked back and forth amongst each other about Fry's temper issues. Ship John Jay is going to make national news, and the news of the capture is going to spread fast throughout the United States. It's going to simultaneously reach the ports of Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. From there, news is going to travel to the south, the newspapers, and to the north, the newspapers. Likewise, when the news of the Vice Admiralty Court decision was announced, the news is also going to travel very quickly from Bermuda to New York, Philadelphia, and then from there to points north and points south. You get the sense when you read the documents that it was full of chaos. The life was full of chaos for the John Jay's crew and the officers while they were detained, I guess is the proper word, detained in St. George's. Most of the crew were young. They were young men, teenagers to young 20-somethings, and they were blatantly ignoring their officers. They were escaping, heading to town, like we showed the pictures before, heading to town of St. George's, getting drunk, getting in fights. There were a lot of brawls. And some just don't return to the ship. I mean, they go off, they go carousing, whatever, and they just don't return. This pub was actually in business in 1806 and still in operation today. It's located right on the waterfront in St. George's. I don't know for sure, but I strongly suspect that a great deal of my people, I call them my people were drinking and carousing here in this location. Meanwhile, all that's going on in Bermuda, St. George's. Meanwhile, as soon as news of the Jay's capture reaches Providence, Brown and Ives quickly mobilizes. They hired the best attorney they could find in Rhode Island, Samuel Ward. He was experienced. He previously had represented another vessel that was seized by the British Navy, and he was to help Bowers to prepare the legal defense of the upcoming Vice Admiralty Court trial. In addition, they hired the best Bermudian attorneys they could find as well. Local attorney Benjamin Dickinson Harvey from Bermuda was hired. He actually draws up the paperwork in Bermuda in terms of the claim and provided the defense. And he also laid the groundwork for the appeal that happens following. Colonel Ward sailed into Bermuda on board the sloop Sally. And the image, this is just a customs record, and it shows the Sally coming into Bermuda. Before he left, and this is in late February 1806, he's going to sign an agreement with Brown and Ives. He was going to stay in Bermuda until the completion of the trial, and he was going to be paid the significant sum of $1,000 plus all of his expenses for helping out in terms of this case. So the case doesn't go well for the ship John Jay and Brown and Ives. It was condemned, and following the decision of the Vice Admiralty Court, Captain Fry immediately is going to set the stage in motion for the appeal. He's going to protest this decision and initiated the appeal along with Bowers and the other officers on the J. Ward, the attorneys, Ward and Hobby, are going to provide legal assistance in this matter and guidance. So this official protest was completed and signed in May 17th, 1806. The next day, Colonel Ward's going to write to Brown and Ives and give them the bad news about this decision. And I quote, he begins his letter: "The court passed sentence of the condemnation on the J yesterday for trading directly from Amsterdam to Batavia, a Dutch colony, contrary to His Majesty's instructions of 1803. So above is this is a snapshot from that 1803 act and a seal from Bermuda, the official seal. There's a couple reasons why it took so long, or why there was a 6-month delay in terms of the return of the J back to Providence. One reason was the driver. The HMS driver's commander, Simpson, needed to be physically present at the trial, but he was usually out to sea capturing other vessels. So that was one issue. The second issue was the escalation in the number of vessels captured created a serious backlog for the Vice Admiralty Court. And there was only one judge, his name was William Tebbets, and there was only so much he could do in terms of processing the claims forward. Once the paperwork was processed and signed by the judge, Brown and Ives were actually forced to repurchase their own vessel and the remaining part of the cargo for sale at auction. So once this happened, a pass was actually issued on mid-June of 1806, which finally allowed the ship to depart. Before the J left the island, it needed significant repairs because it had just been sitting there for some 6 months. So repairs were made to make it seaworthy. Provisions are going to be loaded, and the crew was found. Most of the crew actually, and Captain Fry, went back to Rhode Island in May. So before the ship was released, they had traveled back to Rhode Island. Bowers had arranged for that. So once the J was released, they looked around and said, "Oh, we don't have a crew." So they had to find a crew in Bermuda, and then they prepared to depart. John Bowers was named the captain of the ship John Jay on her return trip to Providence. Ward's going to sail back home with her on this voyage. They're going to leave Bermuda and they're going to sail past St. Catherine's Fort, which is on the tip of the island of St. George's up in the top, which is a screenshot below where I was there actually. So when they leave Bermuda, they're going to sail past this point and head north. It's kind of cool. So I figured if I was sitting there in 1806, I would have seen that. Once back in Providence, the partners, Brown and Ives, and their attorneys, they start working on the appeal process right away. There's no room for delay here. So they're going to work on the appeal. They're going to hire the best attorneys they could find in London to move the process forward. They're going to win this appeal in the High Court of Admiralty, which is going to reverse that Vice Admiralty Court decision. And this is a image I took of the court case at the High Admiralty Court case in London at the National Archives in Kew. This is I took a picture of it before I unbundled the entire thing and read it. So news of the reversal hits Bermuda, the Bermuda Gazette in April 1808. And what's interesting about the Royal Gazette, the Gazette in Bermuda, the newspaper in Bermuda, it's a great resource It's been digitized. It's available readily available through the Bermuda National Library. Unfortunately for me, the 6 months that I need are missing. So January to June of 1806 is missing. Ellen Hollis, who's the librarian down there, was looking for them as well. So she's still on the case looking for this, and she's hoping she can find it in London and get a digital copy and then send me a copy as well. Keeping my fingers crossed. So in terms of next steps here, I still need to do research. I need to go back to London. I'm kind of another big part of the story, I think, as it materializes, not only the ship John Jay, but the driver and Simpson and that interconnectivity. So I need to go back to the National Archives. I know I can find more information there. I also need to do a little bit of research on the US national perspective. John Jay, Jefferson, and then Madison as well. And really exciting, Rick Ring, who's at the Rhode Island Historical Society, just contacted me last week, and he let me know that there was an additional 100 linear feet, which is a lot, 100 linear feet of Brown and Ives records that the family, the business, is going to transmit to the Rhode Island Historical Society. So they're going to move the records from the possession of the family to the library, and they're going to be open for research for the first time. So this is a lot of documentation that I haven't seen. Some of it pertains to maritime. I just don't know what percentage. There's a lot that have to deal with Western lands. It was a somewhat of an inventory taken, so I have an idea of what's in there, but I think it's going to be kind of cool to see, and it kind of dovetails what I've done before. So I think these are all the people that helped me thus far in my journey, and thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
If you can have people come up.
Can I move here?
Yes,
Oh,
perfect.
okay.
Just, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the desk to ask the questions so that our audience online is able
Renee, put my.
to hear. No, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, that's fascinating. I'm going to ask the first question,
Okay.
and then other people will come up and ask
Okay.
questions too. So, I wondered it was interesting, I forget what the newspaper article said about the Vice Admiralty Court in Bermuda. I think they said the rogue Vice Admiralty
Yeah,
Court.
rogue, and they were pirates, and they attributed
So
it to illegal activity.
So I wondered what the High Court of Admiralty in London thought about the Vice Admiralty Court in Bermuda, and whether the administrations in London were sympathetic towards neutral trading rights, whether that changed over time. So what did London think of
All right,
Bermuda?
what did London think of Bermuda? London, the High Court of Admiralty, one reason why they reversed that decision was they didn't think much of what had happened at the Vice Admiralty Court level. Not sure yet. I need to do more research on whether this was lip service, an appeasement towards the Americans in New England especially, and Rhode Island especially, or there was something else going on here. There was a definite change in London in terms of administration, in terms of the ministry. So when William Pitt dies in January of 1806, who had been hardcore in terms of pursuing neutrals, it's going to become a little more relaxed with the Fox and Grenville administration. So that's going to, and in that sweet spot, if you will, it's a short period of time, but in that sweet spot, the High Admiralty Court heard the decision for the appeal and therefore reversed the decision. Why I say I'm not sure yet, because Simpson, if they had issues with the Vice Admiralty Court or had issues, London had issues with what Simpson was doing, they would have taken him to task. But it seems from my research thus far that he was promoted afterwards. So he got a bigger ship. So I don't think that they weren't too upset with what he was actually doing. Does that make sense? Anybody else have any other questions? Sure.
I have a question. So I was wondering, after they went to the high courts in London, they hired attorneys from London, and I was wondering if there's a reason they did that instead of sending American attorneys over in their place.
There was a timetable factor, number one, because the attorneys were already there. And number two, they wanted somebody with the connections and that personal connection to facilitate the process through the high court. And also you needed to really be knowledgeable about presenting a case to the high court. So that's why they hired specific attorneys to do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you, that was fabulous. So in order to reconstruct the narrative or the history, you have to focus very tightly, narrowly, in a sense narrowly. But how do these events connect with some of the larger events or some of the other events going on around, such as what's going on in Haiti?
With the, so what's going on with the revolution in Haiti, what's going on. So they're hearing news about all these things
Right.
coming in on the ship. So there is that communication that happens.
Right.
So it definitely, that plays a part. And you get, when you read through a lot of the records, you get the sense that it's, there's a lot of activity out there in
Right.
terms of news traveling and how correspondence travels globally at this point in time, because it is a global world and global business ventures.
Right.
That helpful?
Yeah, it's very helpful.
But think about correspondence in 1800. I mean, everything's handwritten,
Right.
right? Everything has to be sent. So I know Brown and Ives process for doing this, and especially during warfare, they're very conscious of what's going on globally. And they're making lists in the counting house of all the sequence of all Napoleon's battles, who's winning, all the decisions coming out of Parliament, et cetera. All that stuff they're keeping track of that at 50 South Main Street. Also, in terms of corresponding, all the agents that report to Brown and Ives in Providence, they're stationed all over the world, and they're going to send back communications on what's going on in their local vicinity, whether it be Amsterdam, London, wherever. So they're going to report back. And so it's kind of interesting. So from the perspective of 50 South Main Street, I always thought this would be an interesting European history project. Mike, you're sitting right in front of me, is that you can track Napoleon and his movements through Europe based on the correspondence coming into 50 South Main Street. It's really pretty cool to see. And and everything's done in triplicate, typically to send out in terms of maritime correspondence. And then during wartime, it's quadruplicate. So they're sending things out in four copies of everything out on various ships. So make sure it gets there.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's really helpful. So just a quick follow-up.
Sure.
So what degree is it part of the consciousness of the actors? The whole thing about the slave trade. I mean, is this part of? I mean, they're involved in the military and the diplomatic stuff.
They're certainly aware of the slave trade.
Yeah.
Brown and Ives is not directly doing slave voyages from Africa to anywhere.
Right.
They're China trade predominantly in coastal trade, but they certainly know of it. And there's certainly some evidence that, clandestine, just as I need to flesh this out a little bit more in the narrative, because there's conflicting descriptions in the court testimony between members of the crew that, the captain and Bowers, when they were in Batavia, they picked up 2 Malaysian boys and they stuck them on the ship and brought them back with them. I don't know what happened to them. They're kind of disappeared in Bermuda. And in the depositions, Fry doesn't mention them, Bowers doesn't mention them, but the first mate calls them a servant, second mate identifies them. By the time you get to the third mate, they're calling them slaves.
Oh.
So there's something there that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. But it's in the time frame. I mean, Rhode Island has this gradual process of emancipation. So it's in that trajectory. Yes, go.
Yeah, I actually had a second question. So this ship specifically made national news because of how the British Empire was interacting with it, right? But you're saying that they captured, dozens of ships. So why specifically did this ship make such big news?
Because it was carrying a very valuable cargo, number one, and other ships make news as well.
Okay.
So it's not the only ship making the news. It's making the news, and it's also, think about the time frame. We're inching towards the War of 1812, right? This is our time. This is our trajectory. Anybody else? No? Got Mike?
Yeah, I noticed in the list of the crew
Mhm.
complexion,
Mhm.
are these all people who would be considered white at the time, but some of them are listed as dark.
Yeah, some of them are listed as dark and some of them are listed as black. Black are probably of African descent because they say if you can read through it, you go through the category of origin, place of origin is Africa. And those are typically like lower level seamen and cooks. On this ship, on this particular ship, those that were the cooks were black. Okay. And there's varying grades in the complexion from white, ruddy, dark, etc., which is kind of interesting in terms of, I think Jeffrey Bolster in his Blackjacks have that listing of what all those identifying complexions actually translate to.
I wonder if any of them could have been Native American.
Yes, some of them I have a suspecting feeling there were, not on this voyage, but on the previous 5th voyage, one of the participants, one of the seamen, last name was Spears and dark, identified as brown. I suspect he was indigenous. He was involved in a mutiny. There was a big mutiny on board the 5th voyage. That was another exciting tale. As they reach Narragansett, they're sailing up to they're going past, they're running aground in Narragansett Bay of all places, coming back from Batavia, and they run aground. Then there's a mutiny on board the ship, and they kind of get back to Providence, and there's a really chaos. There's chaos on that the previous voyage number 5 as well. Yeah, Ron.
So, you know how much this cost them? They had to buy their own ship back. They had to pay the lawyers. They had the time when they weren't trading. It must have been a big financial blow.
It was a huge financial blow. They make reference to it. I don't remember the exact dollar figure off the top of my head. I do know they paid their Bermudian attorneys $7,000, which is a hefty sum in that point in time. Ward got $1,000. They had to repurchase the vessel. I believe it was for 20,000 pounds. And then plus all the think about the losses in terms of, so the ship's sitting there doing nothing for 6 months. That's just a loss in and of itself. Plus all the people that are down there connected with the vessel that are Americans, they have to support. So what's interesting about that, they have to provide for provisions, food, etc. All that, that when they get into trouble, they have to bail them out, all those kinds of things. So we have receipts. There's a lot of correspondence back and forth, especially Bowers is valuable here because he's creating detailed correspondence back to Brown and Ives. And Brown and Ives is itemizing. I have to look at the record, the accounting records that get that final total, but it was a loss technically, but it was insured. So technically they don't really lost tremendously, but it took a long process to get their money, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
So was it a complete loss, or was it like why would they not just give up on the ship or abandon it? Were there just laws against that?
They could have not repurchased their own vessel. Yeah, they could have. It could have gone to auction. Somebody else could have gotten it. They made the conscious effort of they wanted their ship back. They built that ship. That was one of the first ships that Brown and Ives actually built. So they had some. I personally think they had some sort of emotional connection with that vessel. It was important to them enough so that they wanted it back.
So were they able to use it again?
Oh yeah, it went out. So it came back to Providence. It's in Providence for like 2 weeks, and they refit it, they paint it, etc. It goes back out to, this does the same route, goes back out to Amsterdam, goes to the Jakarta again, but this time it's going to run aground. It's going to be shipwrecked, and it's going to be shipwrecked, and it doesn't come home again. So it's kind of a bittersweet. So they actually get the news of the appeal and the appeal that they win on appeal, but the ship is a total loss because it's shipwrecked. Yes, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, you made that question. I'm curious if are there like insurance policies?
Oh yeah, insurance is a big issue.
Are you able to document?
Yeah, there's a big. There was a multiple insurance agencies, local insurance agencies in particular in Rhode Island that were insuring this voyage. So when I mentioned at the onset that the community was involved, this is one of the ways that the community was involved in terms of insuring this voyage. That makes sense? Okay, and they're very anxious about this. So they had to get, they had to, and bankers were involved as well because to buy the ship back, and the Brown and Ives were, they hit them up with loans and things like that because of the timetable. So it was particularly, January 1806 was particularly problematic. for the company. Yes.
Did that cause any like changes in insurance policies afterwards, considering how many ships started getting captured by the British?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, change, insurance rates go up. And it becomes more hazardous and more of a risk. No different than today, right? I mean, yes, it's hazard risk, insurance rates go up. Anything else? No. So that's where I stand right now. I still need to do a lot of work, but it's making, I think I'm making progress. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Oh,
you so
thank you,
much,
ma'am.
Kathy, for a great talk and amazing how you were able to reconstruct all the details of the voyage. Thank you for coming. I hope you all will join us again on February 10th when Jimena Sevilla, sitting right here with us today, will be giving our next brown bag presentation. Thank you again.
Thank
Kathy.
you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.